In 1997, a hardware store employee in Barrie, Ontario, received a letter with no return address. Inside was a cashier's check for 40,000 Canadian dollars and a single handwritten line for the 6 hours in Toronto, 1977. The employee's name was Raymond Kowalski. He had not spoken to the person who sent the check in 20 years. He had not been certain, until the check arrived, that the person even remembered he existed. He sat in his car in the hardware store parking lot for 20 minutes before he went back inside. His co-workers said he seemed different for the rest of the week. He was. To understand why a cashier's check for $40,000 arrived in a hardware store employee's mailbox in Barrie, Ontario in the spring of 1997, you have to go back 20 years. You have to go back to the Harbour Castle Hotel in Toronto on the night of February 26, 1977, and to what happened in the hours that followed, and to the 6 hours that two men spent in a holding cell at the downtown precinct while the city decided what to do with them. The 1977 Toronto drug arrest is one of the most documented episodes in Rolling Stone's history. Keith Richards has discussed it in interviews, in his autobiography, in the casual way that people discuss events that were catastrophic at the time and have since been absorbed into the mythology of a life. The broad facts are well known: the arrest, the heroin, the trafficking charge that carried a potential life sentence, the year of legal proceedings that followed, the community service, performing 2 benefit concerts for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind that the judge ultimately accepted in lieu of a custodial sentence, the near dissolution of the Rolling Stones that the arrest precipitated, and that the band survived by the specific combination of stubbornness and mutual dependency that had held them together through everything else. What has never been part of the public record is the holding cell, and the man who was in it. Raymond Kowalski was 29 years old in February of 1977. He had grown up in Hamilton, Ontario, in a Polish-Canadian family that had arrived in Canada in 1952 with very little and had built, over 25 years, a life that was solid without being comfortable. His father worked in the steel industry. His mother cleaned offices in the evenings. And Raymond had understood from an early age that the distance between having enough and not having enough was a distance measured in consistent daily effort and not much else. He had not maintained that understanding consistently in his 20s. He had made decisions that his parents would not have recognized as the product of the values they had tried to give him. On the night of February 26, 1977, one of those decisions had resulted in his being picked up by Toronto police on a charge that was, compared to what was happening elsewhere in the precinct that night, relatively minor: a fine, a court date. He would be released in the morning. He was placed in a holding cell at 11:45 at night. The cell already had an occupant. Keith Richards was 33 years old. He had been in the cell for approximately 2 hours. He was not, by his own subsequent account, in a condition that made him an obviously appealing conversational partner. He was tired and frightened in the specific way that a person is frightened when they have just been told that the charge against them carries a sentence measured in decades rather than months, and when the full weight of what that means for every part of their life has begun to arrive in successive waves that do not space themselves considerately. Raymond sat down on the opposite bench. He looked at the man across from him. He did not recognize him. In 1977, Keith Richards was famous, but famous in the specific way that rock musicians were famous, intensely within a certain world and less completely outside it. Raymond Kowalski had not grown up in that world. He knew the Rolling Stones the way most people knew them, as a name, as a sound on the radio, as a cultural fact rather than a personal interest, the poster on his younger brother's bedroom wall, the song that came on at parties, a band that existed somewhere in the background of a life that was occupied with other things. The man sitting across from him in a holding cell in Toronto at midnight looked like someone who had had a bad night. He was pale and tired and wearing clothes that suggested money without currently suggesting comfort. His hands were on his knees. He was looking at the floor with the expression of someone conducting an internal conversation that was not going well. Raymond had also had a bad night. He sat down. He looked at the floor. After a few minutes, he looked up. After a few more minutes, he said something to the man across from him. The man across from him said something back, and that was how the 6 hours began. They talked for 6 hours. Keith would say later, in the one private context in which he discussed that night in any detail, that the conversation was the strangest and in some ways the most honest he had ever had with a stranger. There was something about the specific equality of the holding cell. Two people who had both, for different reasons and in different ways, made decisions that had landed them in the same place, with nothing to perform for each other and no reason to be anything except what they actually were. That removed the usual architecture of a conversation between strangers. Raymond did not know who Keith was. Keith could not be who Keith Richards was. They were just two men at 3 in the morning with time to fill and nothing to lose by filling it honestly. Raymond talked about Hamilton, about his parents, about the specific shape of a life that he could see clearly from the inside of a holding cell in a way that he had not been able to see it from the outside. He talked about what he had been doing and what he had been avoiding doing, and the difference between the two, which was a difference he had been successfully not thinking about for several years, and which the particular clarity of a bad night had made temporarily unavoidable. Keith listened. He asked questions that Raymond said later were not the questions a person asks when they are waiting for their turn to speak, but the questions a person asks when they are actually trying to understand something. He talked about his own situation with a directness that surprised Raymond, not defending it, not minimizing it, not performing the version of himself that the public knew. He talked about it the way a person talks about something they have been running from for long enough that they have run out of energy for the running. At 6 in the morning, a guard came to the cell. Raymond's fine had been processed. He was free to go. He stood up, picked up his jacket, and looked at the man across from him who was not going anywhere yet. He extended his hand. Keith shook it. Raymond walked out of the holding cell and into the Toronto morning, and that was the last time, for 20 years, that they had any contact. Keith Richards spent the next year navigating the legal process that his arrest had initiated. The proceedings were long and uncertain and conducted under the specific pressure of knowing that the wrong outcome would end the Rolling Stones and alter the trajectory of everyone connected to them. He performed the 2 benefit concerts. He waited. The judge made his decision. The Stones continued. Life, in the way that life does when it has been given back to you by a legal system that did not have to give it back, resumed. He spent the years after that doing what he had always done, making music, touring, being the specific version of himself that the world required. The 1977 arrest became part of the mythology, then part of the autobiography, then part of the standard interview question list. He answered questions about it hundreds of times. He answered them accurately and without self-pity, and with the specific equanimity of someone who has accepted that a thing happened and that it is now part of the permanent record. But Raymond Kowalski stayed in some part of his memory in the way that people sometimes stay when you have met them at a moment of mutual vulnerability and seen something true about them and about yourself in the same glance. He thought about him periodically. He did not know how to find him. This was 1977, then 1978, then the 1980s, and the infrastructure that makes it possible to locate a stranger from a brief encounter did not yet exist in the form it would later take. Raymond Kowalski from Hamilton, Ontario, who had been released from a Toronto holding cell on the morning of February 27, 1977, was not a person that any available system could easily locate. Keith carried the question of what had happened to him without a mechanism for answering it. In the mid-1990s, the mechanism began to exist. It was partial and imperfect. The Internet in 1995 and 1996 was not the instrument of location that it would become, but it was a beginning. Keith had people who could make inquiries through channels that were not available to ordinary individuals. It took 2 years. In early 1997, a name and an address came back. Raymond Kowalski, hardware store, Barrie, Ontario. The cashier's check was the first contact. Keith had thought carefully about what the first contact should be. A phone call seemed like too much, too sudden, too much pressure on Raymond to respond in real time to something that would require time to process. A letter with words in it seemed insufficient. The check said something that words might have cluttered. It said, "I remembered." It said, "The 6 hours mattered." It said, "I hope the 20 years have been good ones, and here is something to make the next ones easier." The single handwritten line was the only explanation offered. For the 6 hours in Toronto, 1977, Raymond Kowalski received the letter on a Thursday morning in April 1997. He opened it at the kitchen table before work. He looked at the check for a long time. He read the handwritten line several times. He put the check back in the envelope. He drove to work. He sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Then he went inside and worked his shift and said nothing to anyone, though his co-workers noticed that something had shifted in him and remarked on it among themselves for the rest of the week. He wrote back. The return address he used was the hardware store's address because it was the only one that felt right, the place where the letter had found him, the place where he had sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to understand what 20 years could mean to a person who did not know you were thinking about them. He wrote 2 paragraphs. He said the 6 hours had mattered to him too. He said the 20 years had been better than they might have been, and that the night in Toronto had been part of the reason why, that the conversation had given him something to think about that he had not been able to stop thinking about, and that the thinking had eventually pointed him in a direction that had led to the hardware store and the 2 kids and the quiet life in Barrie that he had not known he was capable of building. He said, "Thank you for remembering." Keith Richards received the letter 3 weeks later. He read it twice. He did not respond immediately. He was on tour, and the tour required everything the tour always required. But he carried the letter with him for the remaining 6 weeks of the run in the inside pocket of whatever jacket he was wearing, the way people carry things they are not ready to put down. The $40,000 changed Raymond Kowalski's life in the specific way that a significant sum of money changes a life when it arrives at exactly the right moment. Not by solving problems, but by removing the pressure that makes problems unsolvable. He paid off the remaining balance on his mortgage. He put money aside for his children's education. He kept a portion that he described to his wife as a rainy day fund, though what he meant by rainy day was something closer to the freedom to make a choice, without fear being the deciding factor. His wife asked where the money had come from. He told her. She did not believe him for several days. Then she did. There is a version of this story that wants to be about the famous person in it. That version emphasizes the gesture, $40,000, the handwritten note, the 2-year search, as evidence of a generosity that reflects well on a public figure and confirms something the audience already wants to believe about them. That version is not wrong exactly. The gesture was generous. The search took effort. The handwritten line was the right line. But the more accurate version of the story is about the 6 hours. About a holding cell in Toronto in 1977 and 2 men who had nothing to offer each other except honesty and time. About what happens when the usual reasons to perform for another person are removed. The status, the recognition, the social architecture that tells you who you are supposed to be in front of whom, and what remains when all of that is gone. What remained in that cell was a conversation that 2 men in their 30s in different kinds of trouble had with each other in the middle of the night, and that conversation did something to both of them that neither of them fully understood until much later. Keith Richards has never spoken publicly about Raymond Kowalski. This is consistent with the way he handled the things that mattered most to him, quietly, without requiring them to be known. The 6 hours in a Toronto holding cell in 1977 were between 2 people, and he had not asked Raymond's permission to make them public, and he did not intend to make them public without it. The check was private. The letter was private. The $40,000 was private. Raymond Kowalski retired from the hardware store in 2011 after 31 years. He lives in Barrie still, in the same house he paid off with part of the $40,000. The mortgage document with the final payment stamp is in a folder in his filing cabinet beside the envelope the check arrived in, which he kept. He has never thrown it away. He could not have explained to anyone who asked why he kept an empty envelope, except that the envelope was the thing that had arrived in his mailbox on a Thursday morning and changed the specific gravity of the week, and throwing it away seemed like a failure of acknowledgement towards something that deserved to be acknowledged. He has told the story to his children. He has not told it to anyone else. What he told his children was not the famous name or the amount on the check. What he told them was the part that happened in the holding cell, the 6 hours, the conversation, the specific quality of being truly listened to by a stranger at the worst moment of a night that had every reason to produce the worst version of himself, but had somehow produced something else instead. That, he told them, was always the thing worth keeping. If this story moved you, subscribe and leave a comment below. Has a stranger ever shown up for you in a way you never expected and have never forgotten? Tell us about it below. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the moments nobody sees are sometimes the ones that matter most. Ring the notification bell for more untold stories about the human beings behind music's greatest legends.